Do you feel like you're in prison today? Do you feel like God has forgotten you? Days without number. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To be put in prison for something he didn't even do. He was put there for something he didn't even do. Can you imagine how you'd feel? How discouraged would you feel when the thought and hope of deliverance failed? When you asked and you helped the cupbearer, and you gave him the interpretation of his dream, and you said, please remember me, when you're reinstated with Pharaoh, and he forgot his promise he made. Joseph had known nothing of the future. He had no idea what was further down the road for him. Egypt's years of bounty and famine, Pharaoh's disturbing dreams that he would later interpret, his supervisory role in the collection and distribution of grain that would later save Egypt, his reconciliation with his brothers and joyous reunion with his father. For Joseph, he had to make a choice. Either trust God or abandon his faith. And so Joseph chose to trust God and wait for his next chance of deliverance to come. If Joseph would have been released when he had hoped or expected to be, in all likelihood he would have never met his brothers and his father again. He would have perhaps never assumed a high position of responsibility in the court, never able to rescue an entire nation from starvation. Certainly that could have been the situation if he would have been left out of prison premature. But you see, God has timing in our life. And the older you get, the more you'll realize that God has perfect timing in your life. And that's why you need to trust God. Because his timing's perfect. Yours is lousy. Boy, I can say amen to that. How many times have I ever made choices to go or do something, and I can tell you my timing is absolutely lousy. Homer, would you say amen to that? We just talked about that, didn't we, Homer? Of all the days of the year that you can make an appointment to go to the doctor, that's the day when it'll rain, snow, sleet, and hail. I know. It happens in my life too, Homer. It happens in all of our lives. But I can tell you that God's timing is perfect. It's perfect. You see, this story serves as a signpost. Like Sarah and Joseph, they were called to believe that the Lord was at work when there was little or no evidence. How many times has that happened in our life? We don't see God working in our life. We don't see no evidence that he's doing anything, that he even cares. But God expects us to stay on his path, regardless of whether you see anything happening. Stay on the path. Don't you give up. Was Joseph tempted to give up in prison? I'm sure he was. I'm sure he was, but he didn't. He kept hoping there'd be a better day. He kept hoping that someday he'd be released. Our third and final signpost is when your struggle seems to be for nothing, God himself will be your reward. When your struggle seems to be for nothing. And so that story, that signpost takes us to Job. He is very wealthy and powerful. He has a wife and many children. He is kind and he's generous. He is a real example of faith. But then the scene begins to change very abruptly. In heaven's court, Satan challenges God, and he argues that Job is good and faithful because God has made it so easy for him. And so Satan wants to put this man to the test, and God allows him to take away Job's wealth and his children, and finally, his health. Job is left with nothing but his pain. He sits on an ash heap, where he laments and scratches his sores and longs to bring his complaint before the Lord. Visiting Job to comfort him are his three friends, to try to explain why he's suffering so much. They say because he's done something to deserve it. His own wife tells him to curse God and die. Job cries out in agony and despair to the Lord, and he wishes he were dead. But he rejects his friend's explanations, and he refuses to curse the Lord. And then the Lord begins to speak to Job out of a whirlwind. He demonstrates his absolute authority, that he is God. He is powerful and wise. And Job is simply overwhelmed by this experience. And so he surrenders and confesses that he interpreted matters that he didn't understand. Oh, how many does that hit? How many times are we guilty of speaking out and opening our big mouth and say, Lord, why are you allowing this to happen? Life isn't fair. How many times were you tempted to talk like that? How many times do we do that? It might seem like life is unfair. But we stand outside of this experience that Job had. And we look at things, and we think about things about God like Job's friends did to him. But it was Job who experienced the glory of Yahweh coming to him. And when we look at this story, we have to imagine what it would have been like for Job to meet the real God. And when he did, he found that Job had no more questions to ask. When we discover God, we find that God is the answer to every question. And so, Job's reward wasn't just the restoration of his livelihood and his family. He was given those gifts. But you know what Job's true reward was? God himself. He saw God like he never saw him before. And when he saw him and had that experience, it changed him forever. I know of many in this life who've gone through some really hard things. But when they had their experience with God, and God revealed himself to them, and they seen a side of God they've never seen before in their life, everything else begins to fade. All the problems, all the difficulties, all the pain, all the suffering, and everything you go through begins to fade when you see him high and lifted up. When you catch a glimpse of his glory, you'll never be the same. And all the other things will pale. His greatest gift was God himself. You see, Job's story can be a signpost. Job struggled, but he pressed on in the faith as much as he knew how, until the Lord appeared. Then all of his complaints and all of his questions turned to wonder. Listen to his words. I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of my ear, but now my eye sees you. Job 42, 3 and 5. Isn't that beautiful? I heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. The way is hard and is narrow, Jesus said. But he has assured us that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And so we can find it much easier to live in this tension and suffering in this present world if we will pause to read the signposts as we go. And the difficulties that had faced Sarah and Joseph and Job will serve to remind us that though they have suffered, they stayed on the way. And they experienced God's plans. And they've seen it come to pass. Because we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. So we too can lay aside everything that weighs us down and continue onward, looking to Jesus himself, who is the author and finisher of our faith. Oh, glory. Would you stand?